Welcome to Marriott Library's Facebook Live event. My name is Allyson Mower. I'm a librarian and head of scholarly communication and copyright at Marriott Library. Today's event is a conversation with Trinh, who will be joining us very shortly, and Phillip Bimstein about mindfulness, both of whom I will introduce here shortly. Marriott Library does these events as part of our mission to inspire the creation, discovery, and use of knowledge for Utah and the world. And what better way to discover knowledge than with mindfulness educators? I also want to quickly mention that the candidates for the university president are also presenting today live at 12:30. That's on utah.edu/live, just in case you want to check that out too. But for today, if you want to join in today's discussion for the library's Facebook Live event, if you want to ask your own questions, we welcome them. So please do post questions. You can submit them on the library's Facebook page, and Jordan Hansen, the library's media specialist, will relay the questions to me and to Phillip and Trinh. The resources that we're going to discuss during today's event are available on a guide for mindfulness, which Jordan can post. Let me just send him the link. Jordan will post that on the Facebook page so you can kind of follow along with some of the books and resources that we're going to touch on today and discuss today. And it's also where the video archive of today's event will go. So if you want to come back and catch the recording and find, little snippets that you thought were helpful, then please come back to the guide and you'll see the recording there. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm sure, Trinh, that was a perfect entrance. Thank you. So Trinh is the Director of Mindfulness at the University of Utah Office of Wellness and Integrative Health and the Resiliency Center. Trinh is also a licensed social worker and a very skilled mindfulness educator, as I know from personal experience. Phillip Bimstein is an educator, a composer, and a musician. He teaches at the U of U Honors College and also maintains a page dedicated to mindfulness that is part of his website, bimstein.com, which I highly recommend that you check it out. It's got great resources. It's linked on the guide that Jordan has posted. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here. I thought we could just start with some definitions. So maybe just generally, and Trinh, if you're all right starting off, how have each of you come to define mindfulness?
Sure. Thank you so much, Allyson, for inviting us and having us here. I would say that the simple definition that I offer is mindfulness is something that we all have already. It's our natural human capacity to be aware. So it's awareness. And then maybe some adjectives that might be helpful to understand would be non-reactive or open awareness of present moment experience. Is usually how mindfulness is understood. How about you, Phillip? What would you?
Yeah, it was nice to see you, Trinh.
Nice to see you.
And as Trinh said, thank you so much, Allyson, for having us both, for putting us together for this. It's great to meet another mindfulness teacher in Salt Lake, especially one involved in doing it at the U. Well, I mean, everything that Trinh said, I totally agree with. Starting with, it's I think that's really important. I'm glad you started with that it's not something that we necessarily have to reach out and find and gain for ourselves. It's really something more to sort of peel back things, our habits of mind, the things that get in the way of our natural mindfulness. And yes, it is about being aware of the present moment. But there's also kind of an ethical frame to it too, so that we become aware not only of what is happening, but of our relationship to what is happening, our response to it, and in that space we can exercise some choice as to how we respond. Because I know, like, one of my favorite teachers, Joseph Goldstein, refers to black lab mindfulness. He says a black Labrador is mindful of, you put down some food, they're aware that it's there, but they don't necessarily have that same sense of what are the consequences of their actions, when are they attached to things, when are they averted from things. But so it's a natural thing, but it's something that can be cultivated through practice. And that's what I'm sure what both Trinh and I practice and teach. It's a quality that is natural to us, but it can be brought forward, it can be cultivated and trained and disciplined in a formal sitting or walking practice or standing, but also eventually, ultimately, ideally, brought forward into our daily activities.
Those are very helpful definitions. It's got so many components to it, and it just feels helpful to kind of hear those succinct definitions, just to kind of keep the focus and make it feel like it's not as overwhelming as it maybe can be if you are participating in a practice where you're like, am I doing this right or not? It's nice to hear the succinct definitions. So I'm glad you mentioned the practice piece to it, Phillip. Would you both say that mindfulness is different from meditation?
Well, I think it's one flavor, one style, one technique of meditation. There are other types of meditation, meditating on the light of a candle, or other objects, sacred objects, meditating on a mantra, whether, sometimes that might be words, meditating on a prayer. And for that matter, I happen to believe that in our regular lives, whether we think we're meditating or not, we often are, but sometimes we're meditating on sex, money, what we're going to do next, worries about something that happened to us that we keep meditating on. So I think mindfulness is one way of meditating that is this deliberate, sustained, cultivated attention, and it generally is on the body, or it starts with the body, the breath, sensations in the body, but it can also be on sounds, it can be on thoughts, it can be on our emotional tone, but it's it's a directed, cultivated attention on those things, and so that might distinguish it from some other forms of meditation.
Yeah, I like that a lot, distinguishing intentional meditation versus habitual or accidental meditation, right? And with the practice of mindfulness, we can also become aware of that, right? Where do we tend to pay attention throughout the day? What are we resting attention on?
Right, as a type of meditation. Yeah.
Yeah. But I like that, and I think it's important to this. Meditation can also be understood as an exercise to cultivate mindfulness, but it can also be an exercise to cultivate other qualities like compassion or concentration, and those qualities are related.
Right. Yeah, it really maybe kind of illustrates that intersection between like your state of mind, like thoughts that you have or emotions that you have, and then what you do with them, like how you harness them or don't, or where you let them go. Yeah, It's like, and then what you do with them is you're kind of combining your mind with an action.
Yeah, and Trinh bringing up, compassion. I mean, in my practice of mindfulness, there's sort of two wings, and one wing is like a bird. Has one wing is the mindfulness, or sometimes called vipassana, clear seeing. This awareness of the present moment. The other wing is compassion, goodwill, and you need both wings to fly. And that brings back what I refer to as the ethical frame. If you're just focused on mindfulness, like this is what I'm feeling in my body, my breath, I mean, that can be good and it opens up things, but you need that other wing of realizing that you're connected to other people and to life. And mindfulness can be a wonderful and powerful way to bring those things to your attention. But they're very important. They're not separate from it.
Right, right. So, what, based on those descriptions, very helpful. What would you say some of those impacts of mindfulness? What do they have on people now, like currently, and maybe even historically? Like, what role has mindfulness played in humanity?
I think, to reduce suffering is at the essence or at the root, I would say, of. And I really appreciate Phillip talking about the ethical frame, because mindfulness, I feel like a lot of, and there's reasons for it. So I'm not judging this negatively, right? Like there's different pathways, and sometimes we take one step to lead us to another step. But often mindfulness is taught in the U.S. The entry to mindfulness is through health and for individual well-being, right? To reduce stress, which certainly is a really important type of suffering that we need to reduce, and that impacts community and so on. But the ethical frame of Buddhism, for example, or Hinduism, two spiritual traditions that mindfulness in the West is rooted in, has this whole moral code, right? And being more aware and more compassionate allows us then to be able to practice the moral code of reducing harming, for example, cultivating right speech that's kind and caring. So reducing suffering on a broader level in all the ways that we are in the world, and in our lives, if you will.
Yeah, a broader level, and also at the same time a very personal level, because reducing suffering can mean to people things like reducing pain, etc. But also it means at root the suffering that comes, for example, from our own desire. It's not just the suffering that we think of from disease and etc., but it can be the suffering of our own habitual patterns of thought and so forth. So like Trinh was saying, it's like, mindfulness is used in thousands of clinics for pain reduction, stress reduction, trauma, and many businesses will use it, or individuals use it for optimizing their own selves and their own qualities and so forth. And these are all wonderful things. But I think at root, it's really about freedom. Freedom, not just from outer constraints, but freedom from our own self-imposed constraints. And my wife teaches. I'm glad that Trinh brought up Hinduism and Buddhism. And my wife is a meditation teacher, also a yoga teacher, and she's been teaching for 35 years or so. And while it's become very popular during that time, it also has tended to move in a more like physical, almost like exercise kind of thing. And sometimes it's even about looking good and so forth. And so I think that and yoga is rooted in something called like the 8 limbs of yoga, what Trinh was referring to, the ethical frame. And yoga isn't ultimately just about doing your warrior pose. It's about being aware, being present, being knowing what brings forth good and what's fair to people and so forth like that. So I think that ultimately both mindfulness and yoga have sometimes we lose sometimes when we don't focus in on what the ultimate power is, this personal power that affects the whole world. And when I say personal power, I don't mean personal power to accomplish things, although it can be good for that as well, but I mean the personal power of your own goodness, your own freedom from what distorts, your good intentions and things like that.
Yeah. And I feel like we probably could just bounce off back and forth on this question for the whole time, but because two other things are jumping to mind, and I love the word freedom. Freedom from causing our own suffering, freedom because we have more choices in how we want to respond and act and live with more intention. And happiness. I find that I'm a lot happier practicing mindfulness because, one, I'm paying attention to a wider range of experience. And, as humans, we have a negative bias to survive, which is useful, right? But we can ruminate on that one hard conversation for the whole weekend, right? And there goes the weekend. And meanwhile, the sun is shining, right? The flowers are out,
right?
The food is good. We totally ignore all those things. So I think mindfulness has also really helped me to take in the full range of my life and not just ruminate on the hard. So I stop with that for now.
I mean, in all the books I've read on this topic and the classes that I've taken, I think to think of it both as reducing suffering and promoting a sense of freedom, that is so just powerful, to think that there's like this practice or mindset or approach that could combine both of those outcomes is just, I think that's really amazing. It's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, and it's really ultimately for me about being fully alive, by being truly and fully alive. And we all have ways in which we draw the blinders down on that, and sort of don't allow ourselves the freedom to be true. And by the way, being fully alive and having that freedom means you're also being fully alive to what does cause you pain.
Right.
So you don't push those things away. You truly experience them because the only way through them, the only way is through them. And so that's a thing. I'm glad I thought of this. Mindfulness is not, sometimes people think it's about bliss, or meditation is about achieving some enlightenment, which it can be, but it's not necessarily about bliss. Mindfulness can be hard. You go on an extended retreat, or even if you sit for an hour, you're going to be aware of all these thoughts or maybe pains in your body. And mindfulness is about not pushing them away, but tuning into them and being aware of them.
Right.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because that was the other thought that it was in the back of my mind. And then I was like, what is that? Yes, being fully human and experiencing all of the nuances and just all the capacities, right? Or as many of them as we can. And then I love the word relating, what Phillip said earlier. It's not just awareness of what's happening, but awareness of how we're relating to it. And I think that's a huge part of mindfulness practice, is learning to have a relationship with ourselves. That's so hard. Right? Yeah. And collaborating with our lives rather than fighting or ignoring it.
Right. It's such a foreign concept for some reason. And so have you noticed this? Has mindfulness kind of taken a different direction during the pandemic? Because we've experienced this extreme isolation socially, have you seen more people come to this idea of having that relationship with yourself and exploring, the ethical framework for community? And has the pandemic added a different dimension?
Well, I'm sure it has. In my own personal practice, not that noticeable, because I have been practicing. I get up every morning before dark and sit, and so being at home and alone has not changed things as much for me as it has for others. But I think I have noticed, like in the last year, teaching my students at the U, who the college students, I think, really had a hard time with this. Many of them had to go home. And here's a time in their life when they get to be on their own, and yet now they had to go home. In addition to their jobs and their studies, they have these other stresses. And I did notice, because I teach academic subjects, but mindfulness practice is a full part of the course. And I integrate it with the subjects that we study. And I have found that the students have said that their practice has really helped them to deal with the stresses and the challenges of the pandemic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people have come to my mindfulness classes to help deal with stress and anxiety. And well, related to the pandemic as well as is not related to the pandemic. I do notice, though, that, depending on the person, some people have really appreciated to have more time alone and to be able to slow down if they're privileged enough to be able to slow down and reflect on their lives and schedules and so on. And then other people have felt really disconnected. So using mindfulness practice to respond and to care for the disconnection has also been something that I've seen. Yeah.
That's interesting. I actually came to mindfulness because of the pandemic, during the pandemic, because I was having just extreme Zoom performance anxiety that just kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, at least in my mind, it felt like it came out of nowhere, but really through the classes that I was able to take with Trinh and the talents that you have as an educator, I really kind of came to the discovery that I had a lot of inner work to do, which was also kind of foreign for me. So I don't know, could you maybe both kind of talk about that piece a little bit, about inner work and contemplativeness when dealing with stress and anxiety?
Yeah, you're not alone, Allyson.
Which was so nice to discover that. I loved that piece of your class of like embracing that shared humanity. I was like, oh yes, okay, I'm definitely not alone.
Yeah, and it's and I appreciate your kind feedback about my teaching, but it's right, it's the practice, the practices, and I love the fact that our human ancestors, um, thousands of years ago, had similar shared human suffering and right, cultivated these practices that are still relevant to us today, living in a very different society. I think that's pretty remarkable. So yeah, you're not alone now, and you haven't been alone for right, like thousands of years. But the practices are an invitation to reality. That's the other, right? To be fully human and to live in reality. And so looking at and we're stopping and we're slowing down the distraction to be with ourselves, all of the different aspects. And so then in doing that, you discover, right? Oh, there are things I might, it's almost like spending a weekend in your house, right? Like, and you realize, oh wait, I probably could, oh, I love that area. I feel so peaceful here. Or, oh, I need to clean out that closet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, inner work, the way that you both have talked about, like, reducing suffering and like having that sense of freedom. I think I had never quite equated inner work with those concepts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, plaudits to Trinh is starting with, you're not alone. I mean, that's one of the key things, is to realize our connection to all living beings. And one way is to recognize that we all share these feelings, and these, whether it's stress or fear or anger, anxiety, performance anxiety. And, in a way, one good thing to realize is that those feelings are not yours. I mean, they're not yours alone. I don't mean to say that you're not having them. You are indeed having them, but you don't. What's helpful is to not necessarily identify with them. Like, for example, when I am feeling, anxiety, to say I am anxious, or I'm afraid, is to switch from the I to the there is. So like I am feeling anxious, or there is anxiety, there is fear, it's present, and it feels like this. Anxiety feels like this. This is what fear is like, and to experience it without making it you. Because another thing about a Zen teacher, I think it was Suzuki Roshi, said that, asked to define Buddhism in 2 words, said, here's his definition: everything changes. Everything changes. That's how you reduce it to those 2 words. Everything changes. So, like when you focus in on, like anger is present, fear, anxiety, in your case, Allyson, performance anxiety, and like Trinh said, we all, I'm a performer. I tell you, it goes with the territory, performance anxiety. So you're not alone, but it's not me. It's present in me. It's there. I don't have to create a distance from it. I feel it, I recognize it, but I don't have to make it like the definition of me. It's more because it's going to change. The next time I won't have it, or a few minutes later I won't have it. It'll change to something else. And so I think that's one way that these practices can help us deal with things like anxiety and fear and anger and so forth.
Yeah, I kind of building on that, something that sticks with me in regards to it's not I, me, or mine, is when you stop and meditate and look inward, right? I realized that I'm not generating those thoughts or those feelings, right? It's not like I am bringing on anxiety on myself. Anxiety comes with certain conditions, like getting in front of people, right? So yeah, and then the other piece, other quote that I saw that I love, which is instead of fixing yourself, get to know yourself. And I feel like that's a big invitation of mindfulness practices is get to know yourself, right? And when you do, in a compassionate way, the evolution, the work, the shifts will happen naturally, instead of coming to this practice with this attitude of there's something wrong with me and I'm going to fix myself by doing mindfulness, right? Then you're bringing that same judgmental approach that we tend to bring as a default to much of our lives. And it's not so conducive to healing or wholeness. So yeah, the invitation is to get to know yourself.
Yeah, I like that. And you mentioned compassion. Another thing that just jumped into my head is the practice of metta, which encompasses kindness and empathetic joy and compassion and equanimity. And one thing you can do, Allyson, or anybody who's listening, when you're feeling anxiety or you're feeling stress, is sometimes you just are, that's it. You can't make this next step. But if you can, to realize, how many thousands or millions of people in the world right now are experiencing that same thing. And, you can actually move to then compassion for them because you are experiencing, how bad it is. Oh, all those people that are feeling that, I feel compassion for them. And then that can allow you to then also bring that compassion to yourself. I feel compassion for them. Why not feel compassion for myself? So that can be a way of not pushing away that anxiety, but just having yourself embrace it, embrace yourself. Well, and coming back to what Trinh said, knowing yourself in a more compassionate way.
Yeah, I love that. So generally, would you say mindfulness takes some space, some alone time, maybe some solitude? Would you agree? Or, is it true that it's radical to pull from the name of your course, Phillip, to spend time being quiet and contemplative?
Yeah. Yeah, my course is called Radical Quiet, and part of the reason for that is to grab people's attention, because radical quiet doesn't seem to go together for some people. But it's also, I'm thinking of the word, the ultimate root of the word radical is actually root. So it means to go to the root, the foundation of what quiet is or what solitude is. And so I believe that quiet and solitude, contemplative states, as Trinh started, it's natural to us. It's part of our human nature. So in that sense, it's not what people would think of as being radical. But what is radical is that in today's society, and maybe in many other societies in the past, but especially today, it's radical to think that you're going to take time to be alone and not be accomplishing your tasks, not be doing what you is on your to-do list. And so that's why I use in that course a book called How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, meaning, online stuff, etc. But it's also just the expectation that everything gets you into and you yourself get yourself into. It's just stepping back. In that sense, it is radical. And I'm thinking of a title, I think it's by Sylvia Boorstein. We all know the expression, don't just, wait, I was about to do, don't just sit there, do something, right? You've heard that? Don't just sit there, do something. Well, she wrote a book called Don't Just Do Something, Sit There. and that's it. It's radical because we have this expectation and self-expectation that this is a waste of time. We're not moving forward. But in fact, as Trinh said, in that solitude, we can come to know ourselves. Mm-hmm. And the irony is that we can then actually go forth and do things in a fuller, perhaps, more optimal way. But that shouldn't be the goal. That's sort of a side effect. The goal is simply to experience that solitude, know yourself, know life, and just be.
Yeah. We're human beings.
Yeah.
Not human doings.
Yeah.
But we, right? But we,
right.
But our society, and I suppose even societies pre-internet, pre-technology, where we tend to do more than be. And I do want, like Phillip said, when we can practice paying attention in intentional ways, we can bring this mindfulness or this presence to activities. For example, I'm thinking of a mindfulness teacher who's a physician, Howard Lehman. He got into mindfulness because he wanted to ski better. He wanted to be more present and in tune, right? When he was speeding down the slopes, but now he uses it for medicine and to teach other medical providers to practice with more, to do patient care with more attention and compassion, and to care for themselves as well. We've been talking a lot about the Buddhist and Asian spiritual roots, and certainly those are big roots for a lot of the mindfulness that's being taught here in the U.S. But I want to also invite, right? I feel like in all religious and spiritual traditions, there are contemplative practices that invite reflection, quiet, connection to self, to a higher power, to one another. So for listeners out there, I'd like to invite you to maybe reflect on your own cultural and spiritual traditions, family traditions. What were the practices that invited that kind of connection and reflection for you?
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that while we have, cited Buddhist and Hindu influences and traditions, these practices travel and collaborate extremely well. There are many Catholics, Christians, Muslims, Jews who incorporate mindfulness in their own lives. And for that matter, atheists and agnostics. So these do not require suspending any particular belief about God, and they actually, people who practice this find that it helps them to get more in touch with their spiritual traditions when they have one. And of course, there are examples like Thomas Merton, the Catholic. The Franciscan monk priest, who and many others. I mean, there's Father Richard Rohr today, who incorporate these sorts of contemplative practices with their own deep faith.
Well, that is a great segue into our next question, which is just a little bit of a transition to a different area of mindfulness. One criticism of mindfulness is that it can be a predominantly white space. how is mindfulness as a community-based practice becoming more inclusive? And how can people of color find safe spaces for this type of practice?
That's a valid critique, and a really good question. I would say it's well, I have a few thoughts on this. One, I think, is for people like myself with cultural roots, right, in Asia, to reclaim these practices and traditions and to teach them from whatever our cultural lens is. In doing so, I feel like we'll speak to more diverse audiences. And again, as we were just talking about, there are contemplative mindfulness practices in many of our ancestral roots. And so I think having more diverse teachers sharing these practices from our own cultural and historical roots, it will speak to a more diverse audience. And then the other piece, I think, is access. And I feel like bigger schools like Spirit Rock, for example, Insight Meditation Society, two of the big Insight Meditation spiritual centers, East and West, in the US, for example, have diversified their board, have done targeted teacher recruitment to diversify their pool of teachers, and have hosted retreats like specifically for different populations, whether that be the LGBTQIA or I attended a BIPOC mindfulness retreat that that was so healing for me because because in Utah, I can either go to the Vietnamese Buddhist temple, which I relate to on some level, but not fully, or I can go to a mindfulness mainstream community, which is primarily white, right? So it was really nice for me to go to a retreat for people of color, Americans, where I felt like the different identities of myself were represented and were present. And then there's an app now. I feel like it's a diversifying field for sure in terms of teachers. But there's even an app now called Liberate. And Liberate is specifically for Black practitioners of mindfulness. And most of the teachers are on there are Black. They do have other teachers that are folks of color. But so it's looking brighter on that front.
That's great.
Yeah, well, I can only add, I'm white and from an upper middle class Chicago suburb, so I can't speak to this from my own personal experience, but I can say, like, confirm what Trinh said, that, Spirit Rock, where I go for a retreat every year, 18-day retreat, they do have boards, they do have, each retreat breaks out into different sessions, and they always have a people of color one, an LGBTQIA session that people can go to. They have addressed issues of safety. Sometimes language has been used that has made inadvertently made some people feel excluded. And so there is, I do know that there's a sincere effort to address this. one of the teachers there that I've read a book by named Ruth King, African American, who has experience, with civil rights. She addresses this. She speaks about our whiteness, that there's always this emphasis in society on being aware of being black or other minorities, but to be aware of what it is that about our whiteness. And Larry Yang, Charlotte and my wife and I just finished a 2-year, even though we've both been teaching, we took a 2-year teacher certification program with Jack Cornfield and Tara Brock, with a lot of guest teachers, including Ruth King and Larry Yang, who is a gay Asian man in San Francisco who's written a book about this very thing. And so I know that the many teachers that we're learning in this program are being, they're being clued into the fact that this is something. Most of these students were white, probably, and we need to take some responsibility for this. But also in Oakland, which there is a center there that is very specifically in an inner city area with a lot of African American population that is addressing this. So I do know that within this whole field of practice and teachers and students, that an effort is being made to look at the language we use, how we include people, and things like that.
Yeah, and we have a lot more work to do.
Yes, we certainly do.
Yeah. Right. Is your wife Charlotte Bell?
Yes.
Oh wow. Okay, I've taken classes from her, and one of my good friends is good friends with her, Heidi O'Donoghue.
Oh.
Yeah. So, anyways, good to know. I've loved her classes.
Oh, well, that's terrific. Well, I was probably in class with you because I've been going to her classes faithfully for the last 20 years. She's doing them on Zoom now, but she had to give up her space because of COVID. But go ahead.
It was her center. Yeah, I haven't been, I don't think I've been regular, I haven't been regular, but I attended her classes at, when she used to teach at 700 East, that center. There was what was that center called? 700 East and 200 South.
Oh, well, where the chiropractic place is. That was the place she's had for the last about 7 years. But she had to give that up last year. Yeah, she called it the Mindful Yoga Collective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, I'm glad to know that you know her. I hope we can all get together sometime.
Yeah, that would be fun.
So I really enjoyed Rhonda McGee's book, The Inner Work for Racial Justice title. I definitely want to look into Ruth King now too. I think the connection that Rhonda McGee kind of made for me was the connection between the need for healing for people of color, communities of color, and other marginalized communities, definitely the lesbian and gay and transgender and non-conforming community. Do you see, Phillip, you kind of mentioned the ethical framework, and Trinh, you've kind of touched on that too. Is there a connection between healing and justice?
Yeah. Phillip, do you want to take that one first?
I don't know what I'll say, but I can. I'd say certainly there is, because I'm just kind of going within myself and thinking about this. I would think that, like, let's say you're somebody on the front lines as a police officer, say. I feel if you've done some healing of yourself and done some compassion practices, whether they're these formal ones that are available within this tradition that we're talking about, or something that comes from another tradition, when you're working on your own self-understand, like Trinh said, to know yourself, I think that can only lead to caring more about other people, having more of a compassionate understanding that I suffer and this person suffers, and so we are together in this. And so So whether it's in the front line where it's a situation, a crisis right in the moment, or whether you're in a policy position deciding on how to treat these people who are being evicted from their homes right now and so forth. If you've done some healing of your own issues and some contemplation of what it is to be a full human being on a full human ride, then it's only naturally going to lead to having a more compassionate understanding of people who may be experiencing things that you yourself aren't, but you know that you can relate because you experience something else and it gives you an understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I um, the healing and whole are connected, right? Health, they all have the same root. Um, and I feel like when we are whole or more whole, it's a practice, but when we're more whole, we're more able to feel connected with ourselves, but as well as with others, is what Philip is saying. Um, and then also, right, a big teaching of these practices is the nature of interdependence. That we're all connected, and there's so many spiritual traditions that talk about how we're one, right? We're one, and so what hurts me hurts you, what hurts you hurts me. So I feel like it's yeah, it's a very natural connection between healing and justice, and yet it's not always so natural at the same time, right? Like there are many folks that are mindfulness practitioners that aren't very socially, globally interested in justice, in justice work. And I mean justice work broadly. I don't mean just direct activism, but I mean promoting equity within your own spheres of influence. So there is a root connection, but it has to be cultivated and practiced.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think with Rhonda's book, when she was talking about how like a part of you can be the source of injustice and pain, and how like one skin color can be that source, and how you have to reckon with that. Same thing with one sexuality. Like if somebody's sexuality or gender identity is this source of injustice or pain, and then it just gets compounded. And if you can't come to your own humanity and your own compassion around skin color, sexuality, gender identity, then it's, if there's not that practice there, it's so much harder to respect yourself and have compassion for yourself, so that then you can extend that to others too.
Right, and that's where also the two wings can come in, because, mindfulness practice by itself, focusing on what you're feeling, what you're experiencing in your environment, in your body, et cetera, while it can lead to a tremendous opening and feeling of connection to other people, it doesn't necessarily lead there if you only do that, because it could also be, I suppose, profoundly selfish in the sense that your whole world, it could become what you are mindfully aware of, and it's all like right here. So that's that wing of being aware, but there's the other wing of the compassion and realizing that that the things you're experiencing, that this other person's experiencing, that person on the other end of the planet, that squirrel is experiencing, that ant is experiencing. And so it does require both of those wings to be working towards social justice and fairness and equity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like the metaphor of the wings, and I like to add another pair of wings, which is the relative, the relative and the absolute.
Mm.
Um, I, and I don't remember if Rhonda talked about this in her book, but a lot of times people use spiritual teachings as a way to bypass having to learn about relative differences.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like they'll say, well, we're all one, we're all connected,
Yeah.
we're all the same.
Right.
Right. And so yeah, but yes, and yes, that we all share this connection as living beings, right? As squirrels or as as humans or plants. And we have relative differences and privileges and disadvantages that we have to reckon with living in this relative society.
Right.
So I like holding both.
Right.
Yeah, and you remind me in those books by Ruth King and Larry Yang and that all discussion of social justice. Spiritual bypass was a term that was used, and yeah, like you said, it's so you could be in a situation where somebody wants to bring up that they're African American and therefore they're experiencing this, but somebody else wants to go like, oh, but we're moving to this place where we're beyond color, we're beyond racial or ethnic differences, and and that can bypass paying attention to what they are experiencing and what their needs or the needs of their community are. So I'm very glad you brought that up, Trinh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important aspect to acknowledge of one's own humanity and to not think it doesn't exist or pretend that it doesn't exist. Yeah. Well, we have just a few minutes left. In the last couple of minutes, this has just been such an engaging, wonderful conversation. Where would you recommend that somebody start with mindfulness? And then what tips do you have to help people stick with it?
Well, my first tip is don't expect, don't have expectations. Of course you will. Of course you will. You're going to want something from the practice. You're going to want to see progress. You're going to judge yourself. But try to do that. Try not to do that. Or realize when you do that, that's just a part. Just like when Trinh said to Allyson, we all experience that. And we all do. So take the practice. If you're a beginner, start. And by the way, beginner's mind is an ideal state that many experts would love to be able to have again. So appreciate the fact, if you're a beginner, that you are approaching this with openness, like curiosity. But I would say just do it in short spurts. Try to do it every day. Consistency, meaning like every day, is more important than length of time, actually. So like better to do 3 minutes or 5 minutes a day than to go a week or two and then try to catch up by doing 15, 20 minutes, your body and your mind get used to the habit of it, and you are planting seeds even when it doesn't seem like it. So if you just and if you sit for a practice and you go, oh my God, I'm just getting nowhere, I should stop. The bad day. Then just sit with it and go, oh, that's what I'm experiencing. And by the way, another thing, let's say you have a good day. I've heard it said that the worst thing for a good practice tomorrow is a good practice today. Or a good practice, no, worst thing for a good practice today is a good practice yesterday. Because then you sit and think, oh, that was so good. I felt moments of calm. I felt moments of peace. I'm going to go right there again. And then you don't. And you think, oh boy, I just lost it. See, so I guess what I'm trying to say is recognize in advance that you're going to go through those things, that it's a natural part of the process, and don't let them deter you.
Yes. And to add on to that great list of tips, the big why. Why are you doing it? What's the big why? That's your fuel. And so I would put that down somewhere and that's visible. You can be reminded over and over, because you're going to be reminded over and over of distractions of why not to do it. So the big why is helpful. And then, heard this somewhere, meditation is an individual activity best done in community. And I think at the beginning it is not for everyone, not, for some folks can do it by themselves and get started, but for folks that need some additional accountability and support, a class is useful, or an app, I would say is useful.
Wonderful. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so
I do see a comment that Jordan sent from Amy Brunvand, who I know. Hi, Amy. She says that the book that I mentioned, How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell, is amazing. You can read it online from the Marriott Library, but she didn't. She went out and bought one.
Yes. Hi, Amy. That's cool. That's great. Well, thank you, Trinh. Thank you, Philip. This was such a wonderful conversation, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise and this contribution, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you again for participating.